Hello, I'm Larry Wilson, and welcome to this fifth segment in our study on great clocks from God. This is a marvelous study, and it fascinates me to no end because with God, timing is everything. And so a study of time and timing becomes very interesting prophetically as we try to understand how God puts all the pieces together to explain His timing. Before we actually start, I need to make a few corrections. You know, I get one thing in my mind, and I don't realize what comes out of my mouth isn't what I'm thinking. Must be early signs of dementia. I made the statement that the sun is 1,000 times larger than the earth. That I have one too many zeros there. It should be 100 times larger than earth. I made the statement that the summer solstice, the longest day of the year with respect to daylight, I said that was July 21, and it's actually June 21. Summer begins on June 21, the summer solstice. And the third thing I said, when I was describing the path of the sun with respect to the spring equinox and the autumnal equinox, I had my hemispheres backwards. Actually, the sun begins moving south in the winter after the autumnal equinox, and the sun moves north after the spring equinox. And that's how we get the longer days in the northern hemisphere during the summer. Well, for those who view these tapes in Australia, what I said about the equinox will appear true to you. So I needed to make that correction, though, for the folks here in the northern hemisphere. I want to try to explain in today's presentation, today's study, how that God uses these clocks to measure off time. The reason this is important is because there's a limit to time. God has established a limit for the duration of sin on this earth. And if we take all that God has to say about time, we can get a pretty good idea about where we are in the chronology of events that lead up to the end of the world. Now, we cannot pinpoint the day and the hour of Christ's return. We don't know that. But we can know, within a very narrow tolerance, we can pretty much know where we are in God's prophetic plan. And that's what I'm trying to demonstrate in this study. Let's go to the computer screen and let's examine a few comments. When God created the earth, He devised 4 great clocks to enable man to measure the passage of earth time. And when I say earth time, I'm talking about the measurement of time that is unique to this planet. God created 4 great clocks. These 4 great clocks are the day. A day is one complete spin on the axis of earth, about 24 hours, evening to evening. God created the month clock, one full phase and cycle of the moon, 29 and a half days approximately, from new moon to new moon. God created the year clock, one complete cycle through 4 seasons, taking us back to our location around the sun so that we know the passage of years. And God also at creation created the weekly cycle of 7 days. And He capped the creation's week with the creation of a day of rest, the Sabbath. So at the very beginning, in the first week, if you will, of creation, God created 4 clocks. 3 of these clocks were perpetually synchronized with planetary motion. To synchronize something, you align it with something. For example, as I said, the day is aligned with the evening, from evening to evening, sunset to sunset. In God's clock, that constitutes a day. In God's clock, a month is from one new moon to another. We even read that in the book of Isaiah, from one new moon to another, each month. And a year in God's clock it commences with the first new moon after the spring equinox. So you would wait for the arrival of the spring equinox, which occurs about March 21 or 22 now. And the first new moon after the spring equinox is New Year's Day. That's the way God set it up in the beginning. From time to time, people claim that the measurement of time given in Genesis is not reliable. They say, quote, time periods today are not like time periods at creation. Well, let's examine this claim. They hypothesize that a day at creation could have been several years in length. Is this possible? Yes, it could be, but only if enormous solar changes occur. For example, if the length of one day at creation is different than the present 24 hours, that means the rotation period of our planet would have to be different. Earth would spin much slower. In other words, if you're going to change time, you've got to change the rotation period of our planet, because a day is keyed and synchronized to the rotation period of Earth, which at the present time is 23 hours, 56 minutes, and a few seconds. So if the length of a year at creation was different, our orbit around the sun would have to be different. In other words, if our orbit around the sun were different, our distance from the sun, which is about 93 million miles, and our orbital velocity, which is about 72,000 miles an hour, would have to be different. So if you're going to change the length of a year, you've got to change the orbit, because a year is connected to the planetary motion of Earth as it travels around the sun. We're moving around the sun at about 72,000 miles an hour. That's how fast Earth is flying through space. And we are at about 93 million miles from the sun. But if you change these things, notice the temperature of Earth and the seasons would be substantially different. For example, if Earth were a mere 50 million miles more from the sun, such as the planet Mars, a year would take 687 Earth days, and the temperature at the equator would be about 100 degrees Fahrenheit below zero in the summer. If we were as close to the sun as Mercury, a year would be 88 Earth days in length, and the temperature is so hot that the oceans would quickly evaporate. It is doubtful, and this is a profound statement. I rarely say anything profound, but consider, it's doubtful that any form of life could endure on planet Earth if it were any other distance from our sun than 93 million miles. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that when God took this planet out of this black hole and He put it into orbit around this sun on the fourth day, and He gave it a sun, moon, and stars on the fourth day, God has set very precisely this distance from the sun and the inclination of Earth, so that our seasons and the temperature and everything here would be conducive to life. In fact, on the third day, God created the vegetation. Life was already in existence on the third day. So on the fourth day, He put the planet in its perfect alignment around the sun. This is how I know that time has not changed. Time is constant. Any change in the measurement of Earth time requires a profound series of destructive changes in the orbital physics of Earth. You can't mess with the orbit. You can't mess with the rotational period. You can't mess with what God has done and not destroy what God has made. Now, what this means is that God's definition and use of time in the book of Genesis, describing the creation, the time of the flood, the Exodus, even the death of Jesus at Calvary, biblical definitions of time are constant. They're just like they are today, like they were then. Since time began, a day is 24 hours. Now, man, not content with what God has done, has abandoned God's synchrony. Let me show you what I mean. God established the synchrony of the day, the month, and the year at creation. These great clocks have a synchrony that cannot be separated from planetary motion. God set the day from evening to evening. What does man do? Man chooses from midnight to midnight. God set the month from new moon to new moon. What does man do? Caesar has given us the Julian calendar in which Caesar took the moon entirely out of the calendar. The months are based on the number of days, and every 28 or 29 or 30 or 31 days, depending on the year and the month, we change months based on the count of days, not on the phases of the moon, as God created. God established the year to begin in the spring. First new moon after the spring equinox. That would be the equivalent of our March or April, depending on when the first new moon occurs. But man sets the year to synchronize every winter. January 1 is in the middle of winter here in the northern hemisphere, and the middle of summer in the southern hemisphere. So we have an interesting picture here of how man has changed the synchrony of the day, the month, and the year. Now, one synchrony from creation almost remains intact. God established the weekly cycle, counting with the first day of the week, and man still honors that, counting the first day of the week as Sunday. Man counts Sunday through Saturday as a week in most countries. A week, though, consists of days 1 through 7, not any 7 days. Let me show you how we often abuse the synchrony of the weekly cycle. Now, before I show you my little illustration, I want to ask you a question. Which one of these happens to be a decade? Option A, B, or C? Option A, it says 1945 to 1954. Counting inclusively, that would be 10 years. Is that a decade? No, that's not a decade. That's 10 years, but that's not a decade. How about 1900 to 1909? Option B. Is that a decade? No, it's 10 years, counting inclusively, but that's not a decade. A decade is option C, which would be the year 2001 through 2010. A decade is always an integer modulus number based on the decimal system. So we have 2001 to 2010 representing a decade. So let's look at the weekly cycle. Let's suppose you're at the office on Wednesday, February 7. Now, I took this out of the 2001 calendar for February. Let's suppose on Wednesday morning you say, now, I'll be back a week later. How would your workers and your associates interpret your words? They would interpret this to mean a week later would be the following Wednesday, wouldn't they? Because you would count a week starting here with Thursday, and so you would count one, or counting on Wednesday, one, counting inclusively, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days, and then on the 8th day you're back, and so you would be there a week later. But that's not a week. In God's calendar, that's 7 days. And so to say it properly, you would say, I'll be back in 7 days, or after 7 days. A week in God's calendar starts on Sunday and goes through Saturday. That is a week. Any other arrangement has to be called days. If you're going to say 3 weeks, you're talking about a period of time that begins on Sunday and ends 3 weeks later with the Saturday. A week is this period of time. And creation's week, the weekly cycle that we observe today, is still synchronous with creation's week. And how do I know that? Well, the answer is pretty simple, actually. The reason we know that the weekly cycle today is synchronous with creation's week is because of 4 things. First, we know that at creation, God established the weekly cycle and the Sabbath. We know that 2,500 years later, in the book of Exodus, chapter 16, God started feeding the Israelites manna from heaven. And every 7th day, no manna fell. Now, what I'm saying here is that 2,500 years after creation, God is sending manna from heaven, and God knows which day of the week is the 7th. Time isn't lost in God's mind. He made the Sabbath holy at the time of creation, and He's renewing its holiness by not sending the manna in the wilderness on the Sabbath. So God confirms 2,500 years into earth time where the 7th day of the week is. No manna. For 40 years, no manna on the 7th day. Go figure. It's a no-brainer. God didn't lose track of the synchrony of His weekly cycle. Now, we come down to the time of Christ. We jump from the Exodus about 1,500 years down to the time of Christ. Jesus confirms the weekly cycle. And in fact, Jesus is resurrected on the first day of the week as was prophesied, as the first fruits of the dead. Jesus is presented to the Father on Sunday, the first day of the week, because first fruits at the time of Pentecost were always presented on Sunday. So we have the harmony here of the fact that Jesus died on Friday. He slept in the tomb over Sabbath. He rested from the work of salvation, and He rose early Sunday morning. Now, I know a lot of people disagree that believe that Jesus was crucified on Wednesday or on Tuesday evening, but there are 2 witnesses that prevent that doctrine from possibly being true, namely the moon and the sun. If you'll go to my website and look at the article titled Great Clocks from God, I show how that it would be impossible for the events to occur at any other time than for Christ to be crucified on Friday. And the sun and the moon and God's timing all clears this up, so there's no room for argument. But the 4th reason, so we have creation, we have the manna, we have Jesus dying on time and coming out of the tomb on time. But the 4th reason that confirms it beyond any questionable doubt is the fact that we have the Jews observing Sabbath 1,400 years before Christ is on earth. We have the Muslims later, in the 6th century A.D., observing Friday as a holy day because Muhammad rested in his flight on Friday. And so the Islamic faith honors and worships Friday as their holy day. And then the Christians today worship on the first day of the week in honor of the resurrection of Jesus. So you have 3 antagonistic religions worshiping on consecutive days of the week, which prove the synchrony of the weekly cycle. 6, 7, 1. Friday, Sabbath, Sunday. Muslim, Jew, Christian. So there you have it. The synchrony of the weekly cycle has not been lost, contrary to what a lot of people say or may try to convince you with. Synchrony is most important because our understanding of prophetic time periods in Daniel and Revelation must factor in the synchrony that God devised for each clock. If you're going to understand the prophetic time periods, you've got to know and anticipate when they're going to begin. For example, The 1,000 years of Revelation 20, you know, the 1,000 years in which the devil is chained to the earth, that would begin in the spring of the year. The second coming will occur in the spring of the year. A year begins in the spring. A month begins with a new moon. And so I expect the 42 months of persecution, spoken of in Revelation 13:5, to begin at the time of a new moon. God uses these various time periods to give us clues and understanding about His ways. And God uses, I have a little illustration here. God uses building blocks so that we can put together the various pieces of the puzzle and we can understand how it all goes together. If you understand the blocks, if you understand the basic and fundamental building elements, you will be able to understand the finished picture. One would not take building blocks and create something that looked like this, the globe. This would not produce this. Once you understand this, though, once you understand what a block is, and you begin to and know how to see how God uses His building blocks, then it becomes a no-brainer. You can see the pattern, and you can understand the picture without seeing the picture. It's truly a marvelous thing. God is a marvelous creator. God is deliberate and purposeful in everything He does. God designed and established the synchrony of each great clock to serve this planet for as long as Earth time shall last. After the 7,000 years are completed, there will be no more Earth time. Let me say that again. After the 7,000 years, I'm counting, including the sabbatical millennium that is yet to come. After the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 is finished, and the total of 7,000 years for the duration of sin is finished, Earth time will be no more. Eternity will have begun. And John tells us in the book of Revelation that the new earth will not have a sun. In fact, it will not need the sun, because the throne of God and His light, the light that came on the first day of the week, begins the first week of eternity. I should say the first moment of eternity. Isn't that amazing? History confirms that man has tried to abandon God's excellent methods for measuring time. A number of diverse and asynchronous calendars from ancient and modern history confirm this fact. But they all fail. They all fail. They all pass away because God's truth is everlasting. Okay, we briefly examined 3 clocks, the day, the month, and the year clock. And these clocks are operating in your life. You have lived so many years, months, and days because these clocks are counting down your lifetime. I don't mean to surprise you with a bit of bad news here, but your days are numbered. That's right, your days are numbered, and these clocks are doing the numbering. And the days for earth are numbered. The days for sin are numbered. And they are counting down, measuring off, counting it out. The time that God has set and established and predetermined, pre-decreed. You know, in Revelation 9 we read about an event where the 4 angels at the river Euphrates, who have been kept ready for this very hour, day, month, and year, were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Look at the punctiliar nature of that time period. The 4 angels who had been kept ready for this very hour, day, month, and year. Tell me, with God, timing is everything. Okay, we're going to look at the 4th great clock that came out of creation. It is the weekly cycle. Now, the weekly cycle is fascinating. The weekly cycle is not based on planetary motion. One cannot look into the heavens and determine what day of the week it is. The weekly cycle is not based on any biological process or sequence. One cannot examine nature and determine what day of the week it is. Let me back up. The weekly cycle is not based on planetary motion. The weekly cycle is not based on any biological process or sequence or function. The weekly cycle of 7 days uniquely conveys from generation to generation. Knowledge of the weekly cycle exists only in the mind of man. When Noah went into the ark, he carried the knowledge of time and synchrony with him. Notice what Genesis 7:11 says. In the 600th year, there we go, year of Noah's life, on the 17th day, there we go, 17th day, of the second month, there we go. See these clocks? Noah knew about these clocks. In the 600th year of Noah's life, 17th day, second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and you know the devastating results. So where does a weekly cycle of 7 days come from? What is the weekly cycle synchronized with, and when does it start and end? Well, you already know the answers to these. I've put them here for review. God established the weekly cycle at creation. He capped creation's week with a day set apart from the rest, a day set apart for rest. God synchronized the weekly cycle with creation week. He created the 7 days, and He capped the creation week with a day of rest. He set the 7th day apart from the other 6, a day set apart for rest. God Himself has ensured that the knowledge of His Sabbath and the weekly cycle has been passed down from creation week to the present time. And why? Because the weekly cycle is a template or pattern revealing God's schematic for sin. The coming Sabbath millennium is a most important concept to understand. God has set a limit for the duration of sin. Well, we're out of time. And like John Paul Jones, I've just begun to fight. In our next segment, I'm going to show you how this weekly pattern conveys into a very big picture of 7,000 years. And when you begin to see what God knew from the very beginning, when He was creating the earth, He had the recipe completely in mind. He knew that sin was coming. He knew what was going to happen. And He's given us these building blocks so that those of us who live at the end can put the building blocks together and see what God's marvelous plan is about to be. Well, join me in the next segment, and we'll discover this wonderful truth. May God bless you is my prayer.